Good morning, everyone. It is great to see you. We have a similar issue, which is a wonderful issue to have. We're having a few more seats and a couple more tables brought in because we've had such a lovely turnout again. So thanks to all of you for being here. I think the tables are going to come out this magical door over here and rolled along the back side. So this far table, you're fine, but just a fair warning, you may have some tables rolling through. And we'll try not to let that distract us too much. But I also have a couple announcements, so maybe that'll all get done before we even get started. So, good morning again. My name is Megan Radecki. I have the pleasure of serving as your director of the Hallenstein Center for Presidential Studies, of which Grand Forum is one of the many programs that we administer. And if you were here Tuesday morning, you learned all about that and then some. We do have some Hallenstein Center members in the crowd. If you guys want to give a wave, who are here for a special crossover event, thank you. Good to see you. For our Hallenstein Center members who are not familiar with Grand Forum, I really have the urge to pick on someone in the crowd and have them describe what Grand Forum is, but I'll tell you. It's Grand Valley's lifelong learning program for a better than 55 crowd. We get together twice a year for two-week sessions, 8 lectures, or 4 days, 8 lectures total, once in the spring and once in the fall. And we unite around intellectual curiosity, social engagement, and just a desire to continue bettering ourselves. So if there's anyone here who is visiting or isn't yet a Grand Forum member and you're interested, we'd be happy to tell you more about that. And these fine folks, I'm sure, would welcome you into the fold. A couple housekeeping things if you weren't here the other day. Many exits out of this building. The restrooms are again through sort of the student lounge area and down the hall to the left if you need that. Coffee and water in the back, cookies, because we all need a little jolt of sugar in the morning sometimes. And feel free to get up as you need to. Unfortunately, this next announcement is not my favorite, but if any of you received a parking ticket on Tuesday, please just bring it in and you can give it to myself or to Brent or Chris or anyone. This is one of the challenges of being in an urban campus. We need to be mindful of the spaces that we have, but sometimes we just get a little confused about who's a guest and who's not and all those things. So if you received a ticket, I apologize. Bring them in. We will take care of it. You don't need to think another thing about it. Okay? If for some reason that happens again today, bring it in. We will also take care of it. I want to give a shout out. We have some Grand Valley students in the crowd. Students, you want to raise a hand? Thank you. Thanks for being here. We love that you're here and learning alongside us. And I think I have reached the end of my announcements. Oh, I will say one more thing. You have noticed that we switched to lanyards this year because we heard a lot of people who were like, I don't love the magnet. We know that sometimes for medical reasons, people don't love a magnet. I also heard from someone this morning who said, I love a magnet because then I can see people's names. So do us a favor this year. As you're meeting folks, as you're introducing yourselves, hold up your name tag. Ask people what their names are. Share what yours is. That's always my party trick. I don't make people remember my name. When I run into them, I say, hi, Megan, great to see you. So just go ahead and do that, and we'll make sure that we all get to know each other. Okay. Without further ado, I have the great privilege of introducing our guest this morning. Dr. J. Barth is here with us from the William Jefferson Clinton Presidential Museum and Library. He's at Grand Valley as a guest of the Poli-Sci department, and we were able to squirrel away some of his time to share with you all. Obviously an expert in the Clinton presidency, but a very distinguished individual by his own right. He told me not to read his whole bio, so I'll read half. Dr. J. Barth is the director of the William J. Clinton Presidential Library Museum. He's also M.E. and Ima Graves Peace Emeritus Professor of Politics at Hendrix College, where he taught for 26 years. Barth's academic work includes his co-authorship of the second edition of Arkansas Politics and Government, Do the People Rule, with the late Diane Blair, and varied articles and reports on Arkansas state government and politics, gubernatorial leadership, the politics of immigration, political communications, particularly radio advertising, direct democracy, and LGBTQ plus politics and policy. Dr. Barth has won a number of awards. I think he's distinguished in a dozen different things that are on this sheet here. But a fun factoid, I asked him just a few minutes ago, I said, some might assume that Bill Clinton is your favorite president, but who is actually your favorite president? And he said, oh no, not my favorite. LBJ is his favorite. So if you ever wonder if these presidential centers directors are, have favorites, and if it is their own, the answer is not always. So there you go. Without further ado, Dr. J. Barth.
Thank you so much, Megan. I really appreciate that. Thanks to everybody for having me. Thanks for just how wonderfully welcoming everybody has been and working on my logistics and all that kind of stuff. So this has been fantastic, and it's great to be here this morning. What I'm going to plan to do over the next little less than an hour and a half, leaving time for questions and conversation at the end, is to talk a little bit about how Bill Clinton's campaigns for president, his campaigns in 1992 in particular, and maybe a little less so in 1996, really have reshaped modern presidential politics. Campaigns look really different after 1992. And I would actually argue that while there are other campaign cycles, other presidential campaigns that are really big consequential campaigns. We think about 1960, for instance, right? The introduction of the debates and the introduction of media in the Kennedy campaign. I do think 1992 has created some really lasting changes in how campaigns operate. And what's particularly interesting is that the 92 campaign and 96 campaign not only introduced some new techniques that are still with us and indeed have intensified and expanded over time, but they actually brought back some old techniques that have continued to be, that were brought back to life and still are with us in a very new and emphatic way today. And so that's my goal over the next bit, is to talk about these key changes. I am, as Megan said, I am the director of the Clinton Presidential Library. I am very different than most of the other directors of presidential libraries. Most of my colleagues, who are fantastic at presidential libraries, are archivists. That is, they are very comfortable in the records, or they are curators who are very at home in telling the story through a museum setting about a topic, or they're general historians with specialty areas. I'm the one who's a political scientist. And so what you're going to see today feels probably a little bit more like a political science conversation than a history conversation. Although, of course, we are now 30 years plus in the past. And so we are now can treat the Clinton era, which I think almost all of us, lived through now as history. A few of y'all did not. All right. So I want to talk about pre-1992. And I want to talk about just how dominant network television was in campaigns, really from 1964 through 1988. Okay? And I think this is important to talk about just how different things became very quickly. So this shows the percentage of homes with a television. And we know there was this huge jump in the late 1950s, but another jump between 1960 and 1965. And really, 1964, the campaign between Lyndon Johnson and Barry Goldwater, that was the campaign where there were in most all American homes who were voters, there were televisions. There were 3 networks. They had, of course, affiliates at the local level, but those networks, those national networks, CBS, NBC, and ABC, they really dominated everything not just in terms of the coverage of politics, but also where candidates spent their money. Okay, now before in the past, of course, Canada's been spending money for a long time in campaigns, right? Really back to the very early days. But that was on direct mail. A little bit later, that was on radio. That was on those kinds of things. Suddenly, TV was where it was, and at network TV in particular was where it was. And this was, of course, in the way in which TV was campaigns were covered. They were covered by these three national networks. The one who dominated all, of course, was Walter Cronkite on CBS, who had the highest ratings. And although NBC did very important campaign work as well, but that's really the lens through which Americans saw their politics. Okay, that's where they got their information on a daily basis about politics. And that was really true from 64. Now, by the 1980s, as we'll talk about later, cable does come into the forefront and does begin to reshape that just a little bit. It also is true in terms of the campaign communications over which candidates had control. And these, of course, are advertisements. And we see in 1952 the introduction of the first television ads in American campaigns at the presidential level on a widespread basis. This was in Eisenhower's campaigns. There were enough televisions by that point to matter, and they were particularly importantly situated in suburban households that were some of the battlegrounds in 1952. Eisenhower hired this guy, Rosser Reeves. Sorry, there's so much smoking in this presentation. I sort of had an NC-17 warning that there would be smoking. But Rosser Reeves was a guy who came out of traditional marketing. He had come up with the M&M's ads. That was one of his claims to fame. And he was hired by Eisenhower for this campaign, and he saw television as the place where it would be. I won't play the Eisenhower Answers America ad. You can go home and find it. They're rudimentary ads. They're kind of funky. They're very interesting to watch. They are very 1950s, and they're very Eisenhower. So anyway, I do recommend that. But these were really the first introductory ads. But again, going back to that data I showed you earlier, it really is 1964 where it all begins to come together. And Lyndon Johnson obviously had risen to the presidency after the assassination of John Kennedy. And the Johnson campaign, which did have significant resources to work with, decided that they were going to put all their chips on television ads, national network television ads. That's where they went. He hired a firm, Doyle Dane Bernbach, a very important Madison Avenue advertising firm. Actually, lots of evidence that Mad Men, the TV program Mad Men, kind of is based on that firm, Doyle Dane Bernbach. And these are a flurry of ads. Of course, the most famous of these ads is the Daisy ad, the nuclear war ad. I'm not going to show that one. That was actually created in assistance with DDB with a guy named Tony Schwartz, who was a total agoraphobe who never left his apartment in New York, but he made that Daisy ad and a few others. But I just want to play one of these ads.
The Constitution does not tell us what kind of man a president must be. It says he must be 35 years old and a natural-born citizen. It leaves the rest to the wisdom of the voters. Our presidents have been reasonable men. They have listened. They have thought clearly and spoken carefully. They have cared about people, for the pieces of paper on which they sign their names change people's lives. Most of all, in the final loneliness of this room, they have been prudent. They have known that the decisions they make here can change the course of history, or end history altogether. In crisis and tragedy, we have found men worthy of this office. We have been fortunate. Vote for President Johnson on November 3rd. The stakes are too high for you to stay home.
I think they're very powerful ads. The quietness is very interesting, especially considering the contrast with today's ads. They're they're a little stark. Of course, they're black and white because of the nature of the television times. As you see from the tagline, the stakes are too high to stay home. Very much the only real threat to LBJ's election was low turnout, and so they were all about maximizing turnout. And they were these contrasts, right, between Johnson and Goldwater. Some spoken, other ads much more explicit in terms of attacking Goldwater. This one much more subtle, but I think a very incredibly effective ad that is super smart. And I would also urge you, if you need a break from the 2024 campaign, go watch some ads from that campaign. We also see, what we see kind of in the years ahead. We really see all campaigns go all in on network advertising, and these campaigns, and this is important because they are having to speak to the entirety of the country through their ads. It's one communication that touches all audiences, right? That is very different than what we're going to see later. These are single communications that have to touch everyone, and this means the content of these ads goes into using universal norms. Okay, and in political science, we call these things valence symbols. Valence symbols are those things around which there is consensus, right? Now, some of these valence symbols may be very positive in that they are the things that people really all agree upon as being good, or they may be negative valence symbols, the things about which folks are fairly universally negative towards, okay? And we see, I'm going to just play a couple of these quick ads. The most famous ad, I think, I would argue, of all time, but then also, or one of them, definitely the top three. And then here's an ad from the Nixon campaign.
Senator George McGovern recently submitted a welfare bill to the Congress. According to an analysis by the Senate Finance Committee, the McGovern bill would make 47% of the people in the United States eligible for welfare. 47%. Almost every other person in the country would be on welfare. The Finance Committee estimated the cost of this incredible proposal at $64 billion the first year. That's 6 times what we're spending now. And who's going to pay for this? Well, if you're not the 1 out of 2 people on welfare, you do.
And there you have, really positive valence symbol, kind of a working guy, a negative valence symbol, welfare recipients. At that point, there was a lot of negativity around that. That contrast, one candidate associating with one of those symbols, pushing his opponent to the other. As we know, also in this case, Nixon reaching out beyond traditional Republican partisans, reaching Democrats who had these historic ties to working men and women and labor. And then, of course, there is Morning in America, which is the Reagan re-election campaign ad in 1984. I think it is perhaps the most beautiful use of positive valence symbols of all time, and I think it's worth a minute to take a look at it.
It's morning again in America. Today, more men and women will go to work than ever before in our country's history. With interest rates at about half the record highs of 1980, nearly 2,000 families today will buy new homes, more than at any time in the past 4 years. This afternoon, 6,500 young men and women will be married. And with inflation at less than half of what it was just 4 years ago, they can look forward with confidence to the future. It's morning again in America. And under the leadership of President Reagan, our country is prouder and stronger and better. Why would we ever want to return to where we were less than 4 short years ago?
We also see in this era, at times, the use of symbols and images that are not valent symbols, but instead kind of rely upon division in society. We do see the use of racial symbols and images at times in ways that are pretty powerful, and these are also weave their way into these ads. The most infamous of these is the Willie Horton ad of 1988, really late in this era. This is an ad that was put on by a PAC. It did not get a lot of run, but it got enough. It got run on television, and they got picked up by the news and was covered there. But then the Bush campaign comes back in 1988 with an ad that is a follow-up to that is more implicit in its imagery of race, but definitely picks up the same very similar themes.
As Governor Michael Dukakis vetoed mandatory sentences for drug dealers, he vetoed the death penalty. His revolving door prison policy gave weekend furloughs to first-degree murderers not eligible for parole. While out, many committed other crimes like kidnapping and rape, and many are still at large. Now Michael Dukakis says he wants to do for America what he's done for Massachusetts. America can't afford that risk.
And there, obviously, you do not have explicit references to race in that ad, the way that the photographs used in the Willie Horton ad are particularly race-centered. But because the seeds have been planted there, people are very, I think viewers are very conscious of some racial imagery here. And we know the power of race in moving folks as voters. Book, and I'll point out a few books, suggestions. I think this is a reading group. This book called The Race Card by Tally Mendelberg, one of the best political science books I've read. I think it's just a fascinating story of the use of race across time in American politics. Still has some relevance today, I think, in terms of our politics. I do recommend it, and it really goes back to the Reconstruction era and then moves forward. All right, so that's where the 1992 campaign begins. And Bill Clinton's campaign, which starts as a long shot campaign, really goes in a very different direction. And as I said earlier, the Clinton campaign pulls back some old techniques and then adds a lot more on top. The old techniques that are used are a deep commitment to grassroots campaigning. That is, folks going out, going door to door, going to events, talking to other voters, and making the case for their candidate. Kind of politics 101, something that happens at the local level and had never stopped happening at the local level, but it stopped at the presidential level. Grassroots campaigning didn't happen. But the Bill Clinton campaign had to do it for a couple of reasons. They went into these small states as unknown candidates, the primaries in New Hampshire, and they had to introduce themselves to voters. And one weapon that Bill Clinton had, having been governor of Arkansas for 10 years, is that he had a whole cadre of supporters in Arkansas who were ready to go out and tell his story to other voters in these more rural places where they were very much at home, kind of talking to other people about their governor. They called themselves the Arkansas Travelers. There were dozens of these folks who went out around America, both in the primary election and then in the general election, and went out in a variety of ways, showed up for their governor. We've got at the Clinton Presidential Library a lot of these Arkansas Travelers, as they are cleaning out their attics and garages, are giving us some of their materials from those campaigns and photographs. This is a group of them with President Carter in planes. There's one of them campaigning in Chicago at a subway stop. We've got some really cool, I'm only able to grab this one photo, but we've got some cool photos of some artifacts that they have brought in. They're very distinctive. Arkansas is a place where grassroots politics has had a long tradition, where a very personal style of politics has really mattered. And Bill Clinton was a candidate, was somebody who had really thrived in that arena. Is that, he grew up in an Arkansas where almost all candidates running for office were Democrats. And so they had to differentiate themselves in some way, especially in primary elections. And Arkansas being a really rural state, Arkansans, I think, developed, they expected to meet their candidates who were running for office and to really interact with them very personally. And I think that what separated winners and losers in Arkansas were those who were authentic in their personal connection with voters and those who were more fakers, because I think those voters developed really good BS detectors about who was the real deal and who wasn't. And Bill Clinton kind of had some natural gifts, of course, but he also really honed his skills in Arkansas. And he also was personally rejuvenated by that in a way that I think was very important, because that was, as I think we all remember, a pretty brutal campaign in a variety of ways in 1992. And that rejuvenation, I think, was very helpful in terms of keeping him going. These are some photos that we have in our collection from the last 30 hours of the Clinton campaign in 1992. They did a 4,000-mile tour across the country to try to encourage voter turnout. Some of these last ones, these are, I think, down near the border in Texas. And you see, Bill Clinton here in the middle with his gray hair, a little less gray than it is now, in the middle of this crowd, really showing his kind of comfort with folks. You see the obvious kind of connection with voters that I think is a very important piece. Now, this grassroots campaigning that really kind of gets, I think, rejuvenated in 1992 really just goes to the next level after 1992. And I think there were a couple of political scientists who wrote a piece, who did some analysis. Their names are Gerber and Green. And they did some analysis on how folks showing up at your door can be very powerful just in terms of sheer people being willing to go out and vote, okay? That somebody knocking on your door, one person knocking on your door, can make a difference of whether you vote or not. And it was very powerful, and a lot of people, political scientists' work usually doesn't matter that much in terms of immediately shaping politics, but a lot of the practitioners read that piece and said, hey, wait a minute, there's something here. And in particular, Karl Rove, who was, of course, George W. Bush's chief consultant, read that piece and said, let's begin to use grassroots campaigning in ways that's not been used in a long time in the early 2000s. And what was around by the early 2000s that wasn't there in 1992 was now there was data attached to those voters. Who were those voters? Where do they live? What were their phone numbers, etc. And then we see in the Obama campaign, starting in 2008, that data turns into a very powerful tool. And data becomes more sophisticated, data becomes more honed, and the Obama campaigns turn that grassroots campaigning to the next level. And that is what we see today. And I think you guys living in Western Michigan are getting a lot of communication, and it is very targeted, and it is using those databases that both parties have developed over time, and they know a lot about you, right? They know a lot about what issues drive you. They know a lot about which candidates of the past you voted for and those who've not voted for, and they can use that information to really guide their conversations with you at the door. Now there is a reason for campaigns to not just raise money to put ads on TV, but to raise volunteers who will go out and do that door-to-door work. That is a really powerful change in American politics. Another great book, The Victory Lab by Sasha Eisenberg, great analyst. This was really about the rise of grassroots politics during that era. The other thing that began to return in 1992 was a very old technique going back to the 1920s, and that is radio advertising. And radio advertising is super cool. I love radio advertising. This radio advertising is different in a variety of ways. I probably should have flipped these 2 slides. I'm going to do that and then go back. Radio is just really different from television. There are about 15,000 commercial radio stations in the United States, and they are driven by over 100 different formats. Okay, there is country and western. There is conservative talk radio. There is urban hip hop. There are all of these formats that are in place, and then you can communicate knowing who the listeners are on those stations because of the tight fit between demographics and those formats. It's a really different thing than television. Folks are really loyal to their radio stations in ways they are not loyal to their TV stations. You really, and think about how you use radio, right? You have a couple of things that you go back and forth between, right? You listen to average person listen to 1.7 stations a day between 2 of them. So while television is about broadcasting, this is about narrowcasting, talking to particular folks who are listening to radio. Radio is really cheap. It's really, really, really cheap. And therefore, you can run lots longer ads with lots more information in them, detailed information. And radio is also very interesting because you have to focus your energy on listening to radio ads in a way that you can just fly by television ads. Television ads can become background noise. If you're stuck in a car, especially stuck in traffic, you're going to be listening to that content, and you're going to become a much more active acceptor of that information. And finally, they fly under radar a lot. You can say some nasty stuff on radio that you can't say elsewhere and it not get attention for a while. You can get away with some stuff. Some would say this is a little sleazy. I think others would say this is really effective because you can talk to some people in language that they care about, that will resonate with them about issues they care about. And there is some political science data to suggest they are more effective than TV ads for a variety of reasons. The Clinton campaign says, okay, we're going to invest money in radio. We're going to do this kind of targeting. This is an ad that was run on some San Francisco stations. Okay, in the early 1990s, abortion rights, very important issue, and the attack on Republicans and by extension George H.W. Bush on the issue of abortion rights, and of course pulling in Pat Robertson, who was Christian right leader at that time, very controversial and not particularly well liked in San Francisco among San Francisco progressives. And this is a use of radio that begins to emanate in 1992. And interestingly, and I think this contrast is really a good one, because in 1996, Clinton runs an ad, and this is on Christian radio, and this is talking about how conservative Bill Clinton is on abortion, that Bob Dole's attacks are wrong, but he also says that the president signed the Defense of Marriage Act, the act that at that time federalized the definition of marriage as between one woman and one man, and then a variety of other conservative stances that the Clinton administration had taken. The very controversial ad, it was actually pulled down after a few days because LGBTQ rights activists were so upset about the president celebrating his signing of the Defense of Marriage Act, which he had done in the dark of night. He had not done it in a very celebratory way but still taking advantage of it in this very narrow cast way with this very narrow cast audience. But what you can see here is just how powerful radio can be and how you can shape shift with radio as a candidate in a way that I think is very effective, very, very powerful. Radio has not just persisted, but it has really continued to have a big comeback. The Harris campaign has gone big on radio. And one reason that radio has had such a comeback is because of the variety of non-English language voters in America, especially Spanish language voters. And Spanish language voters, Hispanic voters generally, including those who are Spanish language, about 96% of them listen to radio every week. It's a very radio-specific culture. Some of them wanting to listen to programs in Spanish, and the Harris campaign has gone all in there, but not just there, in a variety of other ways in which the Harris campaign has used it. The Trump campaign has done less investment in radio to date. That may change in the coming weeks because you can make quick decisions to go on radio. And I think it's an area where you can be very responsive and say some things that you probably wouldn't want to say in other settings. All right. Now, that narrowcasting that we see on radio also begins to show itself in other formats, especially on television in 1992, because the Clinton campaign realized that cable television, which of course had become a reality in the 1980s, was something that could be used in a way to communicate with voters in a more direct way about the issues they cared about. And so what we began to see the Clinton campaign do is to book ads in very specific ways only on a subset of cable stations so that they are not wasting communication in a broadcast way to folks who don't care about those issues, but they can also target in a way that actually has more of an impact. Most of this narrowcasting was geographical, and this is a good example of it.
It's morning in Decaturville, Tennessee. But for 650 people who once worked here, there are no jobs. The Decaturville sportswear factory closed and moved overseas.
We were just family. It was a good place to work.
It just hurts plumb down to the heart.
It didn't have to happen. As 60 Minutes reported, the Bush administration used your tax dollars to lure this sportswear factory to move to El Salvador. Tax incentives, low-interest loans.
That sign means nothing, really. Not if the government's going to take it away from you.
Buy made in the USA? How can I buy made in the USA when I'm drawing unemployment?
We're Brasher, 27 years.
In the last 4 years, we've lost tens of thousands of textile jobs, many here in the South. George Bush is using your tax dollars to help make it happen. Clinton Gore, ready to invest in America. Clinton Gore, for people, for a change.
What this narrowcasting allowed on cable, it allowed the Clinton campaign, Clinton Gore campaign, to really emphasize their conservatism on certain issues, especially the death penalty, welfare reform, things like that, and emphasize those issues by running those ads on certain stations, but not running them on other stations where they would be seen in a more negative light and actually might turn off some more core Democratic voters. So what this allows is a more targeted campaign. Now, some people say this is a problem, right? Is that we're one country and we need to have one communication about the future of our country. Others would say, no, this makes perfect sense because voters want to hear about the issues that matter most to them. So I think there are some interesting conversations to be had about the upsides and downsides of this. Now, what we've seen since 1992, of course, especially with the rise of the internet, is the ability to narrowcast even more aggressively and move beyond geography, which cable allows you to do, to go in a more focused way to hone in on some other issues with subgroups of voters. Now, what has happened, this first happened on cable television as it became very clear that while not as finely honed as radio stations are, TV stations, cable TV stations, they are narrowcast audiences, right? We know who listens to Hallmark or watches the Hallmark station, okay? And we know who watches ESPN, right? They're different demographics, right? And you can therefore have conversations with different people who are in different parts of the nation geographically. But we are seeing on the internet even more finely targeted work. Here's an ad from Hillary Clinton's campaign in 2016.
Let's go Hillary, that's my opinion. I will be voting for Hillary. Her resume speaks for itself. She definitely has the experience in the office.
I don't want someone running the country as a business. I'm a human being.
If we want a hotel, we'll call Donald Trump.
All the respect she gives every individual, that's what I appreciate from Hillary Clinton.
Since Obama voted for Hillary, I'm voting for Hillary.
A non-vote is definitely a vote for Trump.
Make sure you get out and vote.
And there you have, a conversation with voters. And you imagine you're a voter of color, voters who look like me, who talk like me, talking about the issues I care about. I think very effective way. There's some subtle music in the background also that I think has some cultural underpinnings, and then of course the final close with President Obama, incredibly powerful, popular figure in the Black community. Here, this is actually some of the really hyper-targeted stuff that's gotten going. This is within a game, Madden NFL. It's a little hard to see, but there's a register to vote with President Obama. His picture's, hidden in a game. There are other games where there are roadsides, billboards with candidates on them. So there's some really interesting thing that's been going on in gaming as well. And we know gaming has certain audiences that it hits. Now, the internet. The internet was barely around in 1992, but a lot changed between 1992 and 1996. That really was the era in which the internet begins to get off the turf. And in 1996, both major party candidates, the Clinton campaign and the Dole-Kemp campaign, they both had websites. Now, they are rudimentary websites. They're not bad looking. They just can't do much. You can hear an audio message from Bill Clinton or Al Gore if you're if you wait long enough, right? There's no video, of course, because that's impossible in 1996. The Federal Election Commission had not yet allowed campaign fundraising to happen on the internet. That didn't happen until 2000. So it's a rudimentary era, but there is at least the first steps towards the internet's arrival in campaigns. And I think we all know, based on our daily lives, just how powerful the internet has become, indeed dominant in terms of campaigns, both the internet through platforms such as YouTube, but even more honed social media. Here's a 2012 Facebook post from Barack Obama, one of the biggest posts of all time. And then just a post last week from Donald J. Trump on Truth Social, his platform, right? And that's, I think Donald Trump's kind of creation of a platform of his own is a very different and new phenomena on the internet. So we've certainly seen tons of development in the ad era, and that's a whole talk in and of itself. But I think it's important to note that there are the roots, rudimentary as they are, of internet dominance back in 1996. The other thing that we see in 1992 is the rise of political consultants as celebrity figures. And political consultants had been around for a while. We had seen Rosser Reeves, we had seen the folks at DDB. These folks are arguably the first political consultants in America. The woman to the left is Leanna Baxter. Clem Whitaker is her partner, and they started a political consulting firm in the early 1930s, and they were hired by Hollywood to help beat Upton Sinclair when he was running for governor of California. And they created a very well-funded campaign. And these guys were the ones who kind of told the story, especially using small films in theaters, because the motion picture industry was particularly concerned about Upton Sinclair's potential impact on California. Great book on that campaign and the rise of media politics and political consulting. These guys stay around as political consultants for a while. Most of the consultants, though, as those earlier guys we looked at, they really were marketers who did politics on the side. Now, of course, over the last decades, we've seen political consultants as political consultants, and not just doing political consulting, but also becoming political figures and voices in themselves. And of course, 1992, perhaps perhaps the most omnipresent of these folks, James Carville, and who remains on our TV weekly, and he honed that celebrity role as a consultant more than others. Stephanopoulos, Paul Begala. That campaign had a lot of them. Mary Madeline on the other side, of course, James Carville's wife. And I do think that we now, this is part of the norm in American politics. Is almost every campaign cycle has some new consultants who come to the forefront and then never go away. Right? They stop doing campaigns on a daily basis, but they become celebrities on a daily basis. Whether it's Karl Rove, Kellyanne Conway, or a variety of others. This campaign, the 24 campaign, is actually a little exceptional in that we don't have consultants quite as centerpieces as we have in recent cycles. I think we have candidates who are just so dominant as figures. They kind of speak for themselves, but I'm sure some will appear. All right, now I want to kind of begin to close this up and move to questions by going back and talking about Walter Cronkite. And, we've talked a lot about how campaigns changed during that period, and then those changes are lasting and continue with us. I think we've also, of course, seen dramatic changes in the news coverage of campaigns and how candidates use media outlets to get their story across. Because what we begin to see in 1992 is candidates. Bill Clinton was, I think, the most fervent of these, going around national media outlets, both network and cable, and going directly down to local affiliates and speaking to voters at the affiliate level, down at the community level. And the tool that becomes possible to make this happen is the introduction of satellites. Okay? Because a candidate can be sitting in a room in Little Rock, and that candidate can have a series of interviews with shows in New York, Philadelphia, San Francisco, all within an hour, right? And never leaves his or her hometown. The introduction of satellites in 1992, that technology which had kind of come to the fore, allowed campaigns to have these conversations. This is from WPIX in New York, an interview with Bill Clinton during the campaign. He's somewhere. I don't even know where he is, but he's having that conversation into the studio in New York, talking about New York issues, not having to talk about national issues. Also, to be honest, not having to deal with some of the kind of gotcha politics that sometimes happen at the national level. They could talk about the issues, the local issues, bridges and roads and those kinds of issues that really matter to the voters in that local community. We also, of course, see non-traditional news outlets come to the fore in 1992. I think it's important to note, Ross Perot was, of course, the originator of going to Larry King. Bill Clinton realized it worked and went there very quickly. George H.W. Bush was very resistant to it. He thought it was really silly. He didn't want to do it. He finally caved at the end and went there. He was never comfortable with it. And I think it made a big difference in that campaign in that he was just not at home in that setting. Here, of course, during their bus tour, Larry King meets Clinton and Gore out on the bus tour in 1992. And we also see, of course, the moving beyond news entirely to non-traditional communication modes for candidates. And, probably the most famous was, and this, there had been one-offs of this in the past. John Kennedy appeared on the Jack Paar show in 1960. Of course, Richard Nixon was on Laugh-In and said "sock it to me" in 1968. But that was one-off. Those were not the norm. The Clinton campaign embraced this very fully and went in a variety of ways to a variety of shows to be interviewed by people, including rank and file citizens, young citizens on MTV, or of course to show sides of his humanity. The Arsenio Hall show where he plays the saxophone, very famous. One of the things at the Clinton Library we get the most requests for from other museums is one of the saxophones, including that saxophone. The saxophone he played on Arsenio Hall. It's a really, it's one of those things that just is locked in. It came in the period where he was in real trouble. He was in, I believe, in third place at the time, and it really helped, of course, reactivate his campaign as he moved towards the nomination and ultimately the presidency. And of course, we see in this campaign this being taken to a new level. I think Vice President Harris has been on every show this week, I think, that exists, from The View to a variety of others, including podcasts. And this has been, I think, this is the campaign cycle where podcasts have really come to the fore for candidates. Of course, Harris on Call Her Daddy, the J.D. Vance. Particularly, his niche really is a kind of male-dominated podcast. That's where he's particularly at home in. Donald Trump had an interview with Ben Shapiro this week on his podcast. So we're really beginning to see that as kind of the extension of this trend line we start to see in 1992 that I think is the continuation of this theme. So to kind of close things up and move to questions or conversation, I do think that we see a lot of our current campaign have its roots in the way that campaigns operate today at the national level. They have their roots in 1992. I think some of these things, were a campaign that was kind of throwing a lot of things against the wall because they were in a lot of trouble. But a lot of these things worked because I think you had a candidate who had particular political instincts and who was a particular political animal, and he had consultants around him who had that same kind of innovative spirit when it came to campaigns. And I think that it's not accidental that some of those things have stayed with us. Of course, the rise of technology and the accident that the rise of the internet and other similar technologies happened in the 1990s, that's also part of the story as well, and the way in which those technologies have continued to be honed to today. They continue to live with us. So I'll stop there and then see what questions or thoughts you guys have. Yes? I think the microphone's on its way.
Doesn't narrowcasting allow candidates to say something to one station and exactly the opposite to another station?
Yeah, I think that's the real concern about narrowcasting, right? Is that you experience a campaign that's totally different from you. And, I think there's a troublesome element to that, right? Because then it's hard for you to have conversations about that campaign because you have two different sets of facts. And I do think that's probably that narrowcasting, especially with the rise of the internet and social media, has become even more of a chasm. I think that's a very troubling aspect. On the other hand, the issues you care about, that you want to know the candidate's views on. Well, and I want to avoid the kind of conversation about information or misinformation, but I do think in terms of what you're talking about, the issues you care about, one would argue it's better to get, we have complicated lives, we have busy lives, and we need to be efficient as voters and get the information about the issues that most concern us. And narrowcasting is arguably a way for us to get information about the issues we most care about. And I think it's also, at times, empowering as voters to hear people who use our dialect or our language talking about those issues, and that brings us into the campaign a little bit more. So I think there's a lot of concerns with it. I think there is, but I do think it's an interesting conversation about the upsides and the detriments of narrowcasting.
Got a question over here.
Yeah. Oh. No, go ahead. We'll come back to this, I think. Yeah.
What are your predictions about how AI will affect all of this moving forward?
I think very, and I'm not I have only the most rudimentary knowledge of AI. I think that obviously we have seen during the primary some use of AI in some very troubling ways in terms of what seemed like authoritative voices, making phone calls about when polls will be open, when polls will be closed, all those things, what date the election is. I think that's going to be some of the most, I think there will be some really problematic elements to it. I do think that, we also know that it can be a powerful tool for good. And I think it can, so for instance, I can imagine a campaign getting a few points of information about voters and therefore knowing how to use their resources better. Using traditional tools, but using them in a smarter way is that, this voter on this block probably is not where we need to send our limited resources in terms of volunteer energy. We need to send it that person 2 blocks over because we have enough information grounded in AI to know whether that this voter is simply someone we're never going to be able to convince. So I think there are some ways in which it will be used in a powerful way, just as in medical research. It's of course being used in a very powerful way to provide new information and make us more efficient in the use of the limited resources and information we have. But I think it also has some very troubling signs. And I think some of those more troubling elements are going to get highlighted. I think we will see some of those in the weeks ahead. And I do think there was a backlash to its use in the spring, but the backlash may be, and I think there will be now, but if there are out and out misinformation uses of it with misinformation, but I don't know. I think it's something that's really going to be very important to watch over the next couple of years, especially in these local elections that are upcoming. I think those are where some of it's going to be tried out. Some of those. I feel like I don't have a great answer there because I'm just not I don't know that anybody has a great answer, to be honest. Yes. You and then.
Anything about direct mailing, and I know we
Yeah.
all get to our post office box and it's full.
Yeah, and yes, you do, and that it was, and I actually had a photo of a direct mail piece on that narrowcasting slide, and I meant to mention it there because we do start to see with the use of data. People using direct mail in a much more efficient way, right? That you get ads about, on one side of the gun issue while somebody else next door gets a direct mail piece on the other side of that using narrowcasting. And the Rove Bush campaign really uses it around direct mail very aggressively, uses that narrowcasting very effectively around direct mail in 2000 and 2004 in particular. And yes, direct mail is effective. And what I think we're also beginning to learn is that it's effective with some people, but not others. And that what we're starting to see campaigns do is only send direct mail to those folks that they have some evidence are actually going to read that direct mail and in a way that it's not a waste of money, but actually is something that's going to have an impact there. And then we're starting to get some of that information about who actually uses it. And some of that is demographic. We know some things about based on age and gender and things like that about who actually is going to have the influence, but then also the issues that are going to resonate there. So direct mail is very much alive. Direct mail also did die in that big TV era. It was just not used in presidential campaign. Again, a lot of things like direct mail, grassroots, they were still used locally very much, but they weren't used at the presidential level. Now they have had a big comeback at the presidential level. How many of y'all have gotten a presidential direct mail piece? Yeah. Who has not? Yeah, no, almost nobody. Yeah. In Arkansas, I've not gotten a direct mail piece in a presidential campaign. And that's, of course, to go back to the whole issue. It would be a waste of resources for a presidential candidate to send direct mail in Arkansas. But it is sad to be left out of the national campaign. So enjoy it while everybody cares about you. So, yeah. Oh, I'm sorry. We'll come back here.
Modern candidates today are using massive rallies with thousands of people. Mm-hmm. How effective is that? It appears to me they're preaching to the choir and not going after independent voters on the opposite side.
Yeah, you're right. They are. They do not. They definitely are preaching to the choir in terms of the people who are in that facility, but they have two other really important purposes. One of them is that they become, of course, a paid TV, a unpaid TV ad, right? Because so many of those rallies are picked up, and the messaging in those rallies is picked up and played on cable networks in particular. So that is an indirect way in which they're paying for themselves, in that they are getting that communication out to a broader audience beyond the 8,000 or 10,000 people who are at that rally. The other very important thing, and I would argue even more important, is the capturing of the data about those folks who are showing up at those rallies, because the folks who show up at those rallies are the folks who are going to then dedicate some time to go out and make phone calls or go door to door or do those other things that really are crucial to making the campaign infrastructure work. That is what's now being activated. So there's been data collected for months at those events and in other ways, of course, and now that data is beginning to be honed, and those volunteers are being brought into a campaign infrastructure that has already been built. And that's what matters about those rallies, is that you don't get that data unless you have those events to show who's a true believer, who will really show up at an event like that, and then they're going to keep showing up at other times that really matter. And I think that's going to be, I don't want to get too far into the 2024 campaign, that's going to be the key question of the coming weeks and ultimately November 5th is, which campaign has a better operation in place to actually turn those volunteers into vote getters. And that's the key question.
So I am going to ask a question that's really kind of about today and what seems to be a very divided public in terms of voting. The value of the grassroots campaigning, people getting out there and thinking that you're going to be able to go to a Democrat and convince them to vote Republican or vice versa. And I'm talking about the presidential election.
There is. I think for campaigns, it's very difficult. We have seen some evidence that on issues, especially ballot measures, it can be effective. There has been some research that has been done showing, and this was on the piece that I can remember was on a measure in a state about LGBTQ rights, and I can't believe it was a marriage amendment or something related to that. And the research indicated that a voter, that a door knocker coming to that door, talking to that voter about the issue could actually have some influence on an issue. That it was a very specific thing, a micro issue, rather than the array of issues that we're talking about when we're talking about candidates for president. So I think that it matters. Door knocking matters. I think it does matter less when it comes to in terms of persuasion at that level. But in terms of activation, getting voters to the polls, it still really matters. And those are two really different roles of communication, right? Are you trying to convince people, or are you trying to get people to vote? It's super powerful on the latter.
I was going to say, because I'm doing canvassing, and I can tell you, even when we try to say, what's your top issue, and then talk about that, it's nigh on, well, it's been impossible. I think maybe one person said, oh, I think you've got some good points there. But other than that, it's very left or right.
But you are, and this goes back to some of the earlier questions, your script, you are picking up what the issues are they care about. That data is getting put back in the database, and they are going to get a direct mail piece on that issue they most care about 2 days later.
I see that.
Yeah, and so that's the way. And so I think I go back to the point where if you've got limited resources, it's better to communicate on the issues that people care about and are going to drive them to vote and are going to make them feel included in the democratic conversation. That, okay, these people are talking to me about the issues I care about. So it's a complicated issue. Thanks. Anybody else? Yes. Right here in front. Oh.
Going back to where you started with positive and negative valence, is that the term?
Valence.
Valence
symbols.
Is there any consensus around what's more effective? Or does it depend on the medium you're using?
Positive versus negative?
Yes.
Yeah. There is some evidence, and you won't like the answer, there is some evidence that negative communications work better. In terms of moving voters, and some would say there's a good reason for that, in that to convince somebody of a negative, you have to provide more evidence of that negative aspect. And I think we even saw in the contrast, this one's maybe not the best contrast in that regard. The Nixon ad, it had data in it, right? It may have not been the most sophisticated or detailed data in the world. The Reagan ad had a little bit of data in it, but it was overwhelmed by the warms and fuzzies, right? Of that, it was very, very pleasant. And so negative does tend to have a little more information to it. Now, the downside is more often than, just as problematically, it may actually demobilize folks, may just turn them off to politics, and may actually mean they don't turn out at all. So that's the downside to negative. It actually is more effective at convincing, but it also has that demobilizing effect. The positive ads are arguably better in terms of motivation, but not as convincing. They just make you feel good. I mean, it's a warm meal rather than something that has the kind of substance that you would like.
This is a little different from campaigning, but can you talk a little bit about what has happened in Arkansas in 25 years that from the popularity of a Clinton governorship and presidency that would surface an extremist right governor that exists today? What's happened?
That's a whole nother lecture. Indeed, a book. So that I'm supposed to be writing, but I haven't. So several things. Arkansas was a place where personal politics mattered enormously. And we saw a series of candidates, Bill Clinton was only one of them, who were able to use personal political gifts and personal political networks to overcome partisan trends that would have been in the opposite direction. Because, Arkansas was the state in the South that voted Republican at the presidential level, but it did not trickle down below that. And that Democrats locally were able to use their personal political gifts to hold on to that. That was one thing. And of course, generational change happens. People leave the scene, and they were not replaced by Democrats who had those same gifts to use their personal ties. We also, of course, so that's one thing. The second thing is we've seen some demographic change in Arkansas that is pretty important, and that there has been the development, especially in the 1970s and 80s, the development of Walmart, Tyson, some other bigger industries in the northwest portion of the state that drew in new voters who tended to be more conservative at the time. Over time, they have become more progressive, but early on they were more conservative at that period of key change. Third thing, in Arkansas, there was in rural Arkansas, which had been the area where there had been a history of swinging back and forth between Democrats and Republicans. In those rural counties, which are disproportionately white, there was a backlash to Barack Obama that was particularly strong. And that then drove some of the vote in a Republican direction, and that had ramifications not just at the top of the ticket, but down the ticket. Because suddenly there was a Republican Party in place that was able to connect the dots, accurately or inaccurately, between the presidential level and those state legislative races. And Obamacare was particularly powerful in that respect because not only was there the conversation about Obamacare at the national level, but then there had to be state conversations about whether Arkansas was going to have Medicare, have an expansion of Medicare, which Arkansas did go that direction, but it created some backlash in that regard because a lot of Democrats voted for it. And then finally, the arrival of Donald Trump turned what was energy against Obama into a very powerful energy for the Republican Party in Arkansas. And so the Arkansas Republican movement is now a very Trumpist movement, and particularly in rural areas. And that has been very, very incredibly powerful in terms of locking in. And Governor Sanders has very deep ties to President Trump, having worked for him, and I think she very much uses that model in terms of her own campaigns and the way she governs. I think that all of those things I think are some of the key factors that came to be. Now there are some things going on that do indicate some things maybe beginning to shift a little bit in a different direction. Especially in the northwest portion of the state, which is growing very fast, where Walmart is home to Walmart. Walmart also has a policy that they have any vendor with Walmart of any size has to have an office within an hour of Bentonville. That is bringing in a lot of other folks who are younger, more diverse, and more politically progressive. And there is also a vibrant arts movement in that part of the state as well. So there are some things happening. It's going to be it'll be slow change, I think, in that direction. But I hope that was some answer to your question. Yeah. And that's why I think that's why I'm a political scientist rather than a historian. That sums it up. Because I think what I love about the study of politics is this story of change, and not just change in a very slow way over time, but in a more immediate way in people's lifetimes. And I think that, and understanding that change that has real ramifications for their lives in terms of policy outcomes, that's why I love tried to analyze politics rather than being a historian, as much as I love and obviously ground myself a lot in historical methods.
I've got a question for a political scientist. Going back to the Lyndon Johnson advertisement that you played, the general electorate now, are they still concerned about experience, values, education of the candidate, or is it more of an identity politics kind of a thing where you identify more with the symbolism of the party, the past history, the kind of overall values and so on that they envision from each political party?
Yeah, I think both. I mean, and again, it's voter by voter. I think, I know I hear what you're asking. I think there certainly has been some shifts away, and I think it does go back to this movement from broadcasting to narrowcasting, and that you have some of those bigger conversations, like as we see in this ad. Kind of when you have broadcast communications, I think that narrowcasting does tie itself to identity, social identity politics in some ways. When you think about those narrowcast radio ads, they are being communicated to particular audiences who have particular values tied to who they are. So I think that those things are connected in some ways. I see what you're asking. I don't want to necessarily, I don't have the data on that, but I do think that there is something that has happened there in terms of how we think about our candidates for office as a result of some of these changes across time. I don't know if I answered the question, but I think I don't want to totally answer the question.
Okay.
There's a question about.
Thank you. Let me just start by saying I'm an American citizen and I've voted. Well, so my question is, how is it in this country that we can have a candidate who is a convicted rapist, a felon, and a proven liar on many occasions, and he could actually still become president of this country? Can you just address that in some form?
Yeah, I don't think I want to. I don't want to go there. So, all right. I think I don't really want to talk about the current election in that way. I'll talk about it in a more analytical way. I don't want to talk about it that way.
Dr. Barth, privilege of the director.
Yeah.
I'm curious if you can give a comment about campaign spending. I think since we've seen this move from broadcasting to narrowcasting, I would imagine this year's election cycle will be another $2 billion investment, if not more.
Yep.
Thoughts about the amount of money that gets pumped into these campaigns, what it means for the economy, but also for other things we're trying to accomplish as American people in terms of, you name it, education, food security, housing. Is $2 billion on electoral campaigns really a good place to spend?
It's interesting. I mean, I think you've answered part of the question, right? I mean, in terms of a comparative sense, are there other things that arguably should have more value? Maybe. I do think our democratic process is a worthy investment, and not just a one-time investment, but an ongoing investment. I do think that we need good communication to make wise decisions to keep that democracy healthy, and that happens through money, whether it's on the internet or on television or some other device. I do think that I am particularly drawn to campaigns that make investments in people in the form of creating campaign infrastructure that involves a lot of staff members who then rely upon volunteers and activate volunteers, because I think many of those, mostly young people who are getting paid very minimally, but it all adds up to those young people are having experiences that will transform their lives and commit them to lifetimes in democracy. So I think there are a lot of benefits. I think comparatively, as in terms of some of the issues you raised at the end, okay, it's hard to say. But I think that, you know, these are $2 million campaign or $2 billion campaigns. We know one of them was a $1 billion campaign, and probably all told, yes. But they happen because people give their money voluntarily, right? And I have someone, maybe I have, you know, that's obviously a live debate of whether campaign spending, campaign contributions are a form of speech. I think they certainly are an expression of commitment to a candidate. Even if they are not speech in its purest form. But I do think that there's something there that is important to the expressions of citizens in terms of what they want their democracy to look like.
Thank you.
All right. I think we're.
What if they're shorter campaigns?
The life of campaign. Yeah. Yeah, and I see one in the back as well. But the short of campaigns, I do think that this has been an interesting campaign in terms of its just because of the odd circumstances in which it's played out. It has been a de facto, a little bit shortened campaign. It's been pretty darn intense. But, you know, obviously with the First Amendment, we're not going to be able to shorten. And I think that ultimately voters make some choices there about their continuing their attention. And probably many people in this room, you know, if there's a campaign underway, they're going to pay attention to it, right? Because there's a certain, as citizens, I think we're drawn to that democracy.
I think we have time for one more. We've got a student back here.
Yeah.
So you mentioned super PACs earlier, and then you corrected and said PACs.
Yeah.
I'm curious about the impact of the PACs, and then when super PACs became a thing, and how that impacted it.
Yeah, great question. So super PACs really became a thing after the Citizens United decision in 20. Somebody will know the date's not popping up in 2009, 2010. So right around that time. So that said that, you know, corporations could engage in politics through kind of the creation of these instruments that become nicknamed super PACs. You know, before that, there had been political action committees. They had a long tradition, really going back, you know, decades. Some of them on the left, some of them on the right. They had become a little bit more nuanced development in after 1974. There was a campaign finance reform bills after Watergate, and they really kind of the way in which that was restructured so that individual contributions were limited. Just in a way, despite the First Amendment, there was a limitation on how much one could give. That PACs were limited less, and that began to put more impetus into PACs. And so PACs really do begin to develop in the late 70s and early 80s. And so and through the 80s, and that's why that ad was from 1988. It was actually a political action committee that did that before we have super PACs a little bit later. Does that answer it? Yep. Okay.
Okay, with that, friends, let's give a warm thank you to Dr. Barth for his talk. Thank you so much. I know there were a couple more questions. Dr. Barth does have a little bit of time to spend with us at lunch, so if you ask very nicely, maybe he will sit at your table and finish answering your questions. Aside from that, we are going to break for lunch. You know the drill. It's in the back of the room. I'll remind us there's plenty of sanitizer around. Let's keep ourselves healthy here so we can stay together and return in a couple weeks for our third and fourth days of lecture. And then one other note, I did print off some of those personal mission statement exercises. They're out on the table when you're walking in, the registration table. I didn't print a ton because I didn't really know how many of you would take them. But if we run out, just let me know and I'll be happy to grab some more.